Hot wind on Mount Gilboa carried dust and the sour tang of fear. Shields bumped together along the ridge as Israel's line bent and then broke, the shout of the Philistines rolling uphill like surf. Saul stood in the churn of it, taller than most, eyes fixed on the dark tide closing around his sons. Arrows hissed past. One found his shoulder and punched through meat. Another clipped his thigh. He stiffened, gripped his spear, and watched Jonathan's banner disappear. Somewhere to the left, Abinadab went down. Malchishua followed. The line that had been a kingdom fell into knots of fighters, and then into running shapes, and the hill felt like a trap. Before dawn, Saul had asked God for an answer, by dream, by priest, by prophet, and heard only silence. The silence had been growing since Amalek, since he called obedience a sacrifice and kept what he wanted. Samuel had told him the kingdom would be torn from his hand, and Saul had worn those words like a weight. Last night, desperate and empty, he crossed the valley to Endor in disguise and asked a forbidden voice for the dead to rise. The hut smelled of ash and old wool. When Samuel rose like a cloud, Saul fell to the floor and begged anyway. "Tomorrow," Samuel said, "you and your sons will be with me. The Philistines will take the field." Saul stood up from the dirt and walked back, knowing dawn would find him. The archers advanced in ranks at a measured pace, their shields bright. Saul's armor-bearer held him by the elbow to keep him steady. The king's breath came in short pulls, tasting like iron. Below the ridge, chariots flickered through scrub, axles cutting circles. Saul could feel the men around him change shape, from soldiers into fathers, brothers, sons who suddenly remembered their names and ran. He could feel something else, too, a throb that was not pain so much as knowledge. This was the end of his house. He turned to the armor-bearer and spoke through clenched teeth. "Draw your sword. Finish it, lest these uncircumcised come and pierce me and make sport of me." The armor-bearer, still a boy, shook his head until his helmet shifted. He would not raise his blade against the anointed king. So Saul took the hilt in both hands, set the point under his ribs, and fell forward. The armor-bearer watched the body go still, and then took his own life, rather than step into a world where the throne lay in the dust, and he had not followed. When the sun arced up and flattened the shadows, the Philistines climbed the hill to strip the field. They found the king and his sons. They cut off Saul's head and stripped his armor, a victory story to carry home. Messengers ran it to their temples, to Astarte and Dagon, proof that Israel's God had failed a man who had failed him first. They fastened the bodies to the wall of Beth-shan, where everyone could see the ruin of a crown. Heat baked the stone. The valley stared and went about its business, because terror teaches ordinary people how to look away. Word crossed the river to Jabesh-Gilead and stopped the work in the fields. Years before, when Nahash the Ammonite had besieged them and promised to burn out the right eyes of the men of the city, Saul had risen with fury, cut a yoke of oxen into pieces, and called Israel to arms. He had come like a storm and broken the siege. That kind of gratitude sleeps but does not die. So, in the deep of night, men from Jabesh rode across the valley floor, hugged the darker folds, and took the bodies down with hands that would not let go. They carried them home, burned what could not be washed clean, and buried the bones under a tamarisk. Then they fasted 7 days and said very little, because grief like that leaves few words. Elsewhere, another thread tightened. David, who had once soothed Saul's rages with a harp and later ran for his life from the king's spear, was not on the field. He and his men had been sent back from the Philistine muster, distrusted by lords unsure if the young Hebrew was ally or snake. In Ziklag, David had found his own disaster and recovered what the Amalekites stole, but the report from Gilboa still landed like a stone in his camp. He tore his clothes and wept for Saul and for Jonathan, whose love had been a covenant. Then he sang a lament that would outlive the dust. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. Tell it not in Gath. Do not let the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Saul had not started as a tragedy. He had been chosen when the tribes wanted a king to fight their battles and look like leadership from a distance. He could move a crowd and strike fast, and also lose the thread, confuse obedience with stubbornness, and mistake fear for prudence. When Samuel's rebuke fixed itself in him, he wore jealousy the way other men wear armor. He watched David win hearts and heard people sing numbers that set them apart. He threw spears, he chased, he negotiated with God and with himself, and tried to make half-obedience law. He also trembled in the dark when the answers stopped coming. The night at Endor sits at the center of his downfall like a coal that will not cool. Saul had outlawed mediums and necromancers, and then, when the silence grew absolute, went looking for one. The woman saw the disguise and saw through it. "What do you see?" he asked. "I see a god coming up out of the earth," she said, and he shook. Samuel's words named what his choices had already done. Saul ate because his servants begged him to, but you cannot feed a man who has swallowed his future whole. On Gilboa, the Philistines were not simply more brutal, they were better prepared. They had iron in numbers Israel did not. They had archers to pick apart a line. Strategy mattered, and so did morale. The king's wounds were not only in his flesh. When Saul chose death by his own hand, he chose the only decision left. It was a refusal to let the enemy turn him into theater, and a confession the road behind him had no way back. After the bodies were taken down and the bones set in earth, politics moved fast. Abner raised Ishbosheth, Saul's son, over the northern tribes. David was anointed at Hebron by Judah. Skirmishes followed, pursuits by the pool of Gibeon, men who never came home. In time, Abner shifted allegiance and was murdered. Ishbosheth fell, and David gathered the tribes and took the throne. But that story grows from this stump, the crown broken on the stones of Gilboa, the first king failing in a storm of his own making, and in a war he could not win. Divine crime is not neat. It is a record of human choices in the light of God's warnings and promises, and how justice and consequence thread together. Saul's death reads as judgment, but also as grief. God's spirit had once rushed upon him. Now he died calling for a word that never came. The men of Jabesh honored him because what is true at the end does not erase what was true at the beginning. And David, who would write songs that fill centuries, tore his garment for the fallen king and the friend whose soul had been knit to his. Stand on the slopes above the valley, and you can still see how a line breaks. The center wavers, the flanks peel back, the hill that promised advantage becomes a funnel. You can imagine the armor-bearer's hands, slick with sweat, holding a sword he would not lift, and the moment when a weary king chose his last act. The Philistines did not win as gods. They won because the man who once stood head and shoulders above Israel had spent his strength fighting the wrong enemies inside himself. Under the tamarisk at Jabesh, the bones rested. In Hebron, another anointing waited, and the story of a nation turned, as it always does, on both a wound and a promise. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.